History as it happens, May 18th, 2021. Checking on democracy.
Liberty and freedom and democracy are prizes awarded only to those people who fight to win them and then keep fighting eternally to hold them.
If the American century is over, is global democracy in trouble? Both at home and abroad, it can seem like democracy is retreating and dictators are advancing. That liberal democratic values face an existential threat akin to the 1920s and 30s. So let's try to separate reality from fear. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
In recent decades, public confidence in our institutions has declined. Our governing class has often been paralyzed in the face of obvious and pressing needs.
Over the past 5 years or so, I don't think I discussed any subject as much as democracy. Whether democracy was in a crisis, here, in Europe, and elsewhere. I read books about the fall of the Weimar Republic and held conversations in coffee shops with my friends about whether democracy, at least as we came to know it, was collapsing before our very eyes. Sounds a bit dramatic, huh? Well, a couple of years ago, George W. Bush, whose presidency didn't exactly do much for democracy in the countries where he ordered invasions, gave a speech about what he viewed as the causes of our current domestic ills.
The American dream of upward mobility seems out of reach for some who feel left behind in a changing economy. Discontent deepened and sharpened partisan conflicts. Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seems more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism. We've forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought to America. We see a fading confidence in the value of free markets and international trade, forgetting that conflict, instability, and poverty follow in the wake of protectionism. We've seen the return of isolationist sentiments, forgetting that American security is directly threatened by the chaos and despair of distant places, where threats such as terrorism, infectious disease, criminal gangs, and drug trafficking tend to emerge.
Whatever you thought of Bush's presidency, that speech was an implicit attack on Donald Trump, who would become the only U.S. president not to commit to a peaceful transition of power. But whatever Trump's intentions on January 6th, the so-called insurgency at the Capitol had no hope of success. In other words, our system held up. But what about across the globe? Also a couple years ago, the neoconservative scholar Robert Kagan, a proponent of U.S. interventionism, wrote an essay in the Washington Post titled "The Strongmen Strike Back." He laid out the danger of authoritarian leaders such as Putin, Xi, Mohammed bin Salman, Erdogan, just to name four, who threaten liberal democracy. Such warnings recall the 1920s and 30s in Europe, when democracies did disappear, swept aside by communists and fascists. The result, as we know, was another world war. Are we really headed in that direction again? Is democracy really in retreat? Our guest today is the journalist Kelly Beaucar Vlahos. She's a senior advisor and editorial director at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She's been writing about U.S. foreign policy and civil liberties for many years. Kelly Vlahos, welcome.
Great to be here.
So we're taking on, a really small, easy matter to discuss in a short podcast. Democracy, right? It's common now to see debates over whether democracy is in retreat across the globe or even in our own country. I think sometimes it's easy to overstate the problems democracy is experiencing, but it's always hard to judge when you're in the moment, right? Maybe one day we'll look back at this time and realize we were overwrought. So why don't you take it from there, the health of democracy at home?
Well, after a full year of protests culminating in a very contentious presidential election, followed by the attack that we saw on the U.S. Capitol, we have very visceral images of democracy being tested. But I would contend that democracy has been tested over the last, say, 20 years. I would say since 9/11. I'd like to take it back to then. I mean, we have been in a war. We're finally getting our troops out of Afghanistan after 20 years. We've been through a recession, the financial crisis of 2008, of which many in this country still haven't recovered from. And we have found ourselves in a situation where most Americans have very little faith in their institutions. This is a crisis of democracy in itself. And I feel as though the last 4 years, and especially the last year, 2020, as being a culminating moment of a long slide in terms of how we feel about our democracy. Is democracy dead? No. Is it going into some irreparable failure? I don't think so. But I do think that it is incumbent on us to look at the long view of why the last 4 years and the last year have happened. And I believe it's mostly this loss of faith in our institutions, in which I blame those institutions for that lack of faith. We have to find a way to strengthen our government, our organizations, our communities, in order to rebuild the trust that Americans have. Mm-hmm. And that's going to take a big, heavy lift from the elites in this country, because they're the ones that let us down. And so I think it's much more than a bumper sticker saying democracy has died in darkness, or blaming it all on Donald Trump or white supremacy. I think this is deeper. This is more existential than we are willing to admit. But until we admit it, we're not going to be able to fix it.
It's multi-determined, I think, is a good way of putting it.
Right.
And I like your starting point of 9/11, because I've been arguing American democracy's been a charade for some time now. Since 9/11, because of the nature of our national security state, and that's not conspiracy talk, of course. We have a national security state, and it's largely unaccountable. It's been expanded over the past 20 years. It relies on private contractors for intelligence gathering and military operations. Those forces have been eroding our democracy. So it is hard to avoid talking about Donald Trump when it comes to this subject, and it did surprise me to see how brittle our institutions were in his administration. But there is, of course, more to this than that.
Right. And, you're really talking my language when you talk about the national security state. And I full-heartedly agree with you that the last 20 years of war, in which it's not all about what we are doing overseas with our military, it's how the war on terror, for example, translated rules, regulations, norms, the way we interface with the government, with our police, with TSA at the airports. Everything changed after 9/11. Americans realized slowly, probably, a lot of the loss of our civil liberties, of control over our own lives, the investment we made in fighting a war came with little return. We found that we don't necessarily feel any safer. We see conflict in the world still rages. We look at our own pocketbooks and our own security and our own communities and don't see them any better. And so we wonder what was going on and why, and our trust in those institutions to tell us the truth. We were in a war in Iraq for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And so this culminating effect of not being able to trust our government, not being able to believe what they say, and feeling as though that you've given up too much with little in return has led to a full-scale repudiation of those institutions. And we see the worst of that in the conspiracy theories, the QAnon, people trying to find some reasoning or rationale for the craziness around them. I am not surprised when I see, these stories about what these QAnon people believe or how things on Facebook got so radicalized to the point of people believing fake news. And if there's nothing to believe in anymore, people are struggling.
There's a vacuum to fill.
There's a vacuum to fill. And that is happening in this country. And so for me, instead of rebuking that and waving all these people away as though they're nuts or a danger, a threat to me and my family, I want to find out how to fix it.
These underlying causes you've identified here, they predated Donald Trump and will probably be with us after Donald Trump. But when it comes to Trump himself, last year, before the election, smart people, keen political observers wrote newspaper columns and essays saying that if he won the election, our democracy would be in a lot of trouble. But I guess in retrospect, we can look back now and say our democracy showed its strength. Turnout was really strong. He lost the election, he challenged it, and his challenges didn't work.
You know, I'm not chuckling, but it is ironic when I hear people talk about the crisis of democracy in this country, and I say, well, who won the election? It is not as though Donald Trump countermanded everything and brought the military into the White House and the Capitol and all of the federal buildings and stayed there and refused to leave and actually initiated and executed a military coup like they did in Myanmar. That is actual democracy dying. What's happening in Hong Kong right now, where China literally changes the election rules to make sure that pro-Communist Party people are put into the local councils, is democracy dying in darkness. You know, we have a Democratic president and a Democratic House and Senate right now. That was democracy in action.
Our institutions held, right? Donald Trump's intention, however poorly executed, may have been to overturn the election and remain in power, but he had no power to actually do that.
Right. And so I agree with you that the institutions actually prevailed in this case. I don't feel like things are about to implode. But there are people who would disagree with me that really do feel like there's some apocalypse, a political apocalypse on the horizon. Maybe that's the case if the filibuster ends and somehow a bunch of real radical progressive legislation starts getting passed. There might be a backlash and things might get really ugly.
Kelly, you mentioned Myanmar and Hong Kong there, so I think now is a good time to look beyond our own borders. When we were arranging this conversation, I sent you an essay written by Robert Kagan called The Strongmen Strike Back, in which he argues authoritarianism has reemerged as the greatest threat to the liberal democratic world. And Kagan says authoritarianism isn't just a form of government, it's an ideology with a coherent worldview that has an argument to make about the weaknesses of liberal democracy, how it can't, say, solve pressing problems because of endless partisanship. Do you agree with the premise of Kagan's argument?
I don't agree with that because I feel like there are rolling developments in the world today in which for every strongman or proto-authoritarian government, there is a protest in the street. There is an election of democratic leaders who adhere to liberal norms. I don't feel like you can place this sort of monolithic narrative on the world and split it up and say, here are the good guys and here are the bad guys. And look, the bad guys are growing and it's for this specific reason. You know, where Kagan was coming from, typically from an American lens and an American political lens. And he and his liberal internationalists and neoconservatives were looking at the world and they're saying, well, the Islamic threat that we had spent the last 15, 20 years telling people was our existential fight of the century is pretty much gone. So who's our new enemy? Oh, there he is. It's Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's Vladimir Putin in Russia. And wow, there's another guy over here. And look at over Poland's not acting very liberally. And then putting it all together and saying, this is the new existential fight is populism, nationalism, authoritarianism. And that is not to say that authoritarianism in the world is not a troubling thing. What I'm sensing here, this is a very American Washington narrative. They are creating a problem that the United States has to fix, and it pits liberals versus conservatives. And I saw this as a reporter and an editor in Washington, that all of a sudden, groups like AEI, where Robert Kagan and his brother Fred Kagan were long associated, were matching up with other think tanks, basically saying, okay, we have a new anti-authoritarianism program. We are going to band together to promote democracy throughout the world. Oh, forget that we were trying to do that 20 years ago when we invaded Iraq, but this is our new initiative to promote liberal values throughout the world. So I know I sound a bit cynical, but it seems to me that it is a very American way of looking at the world, by putting everything in nice, neat little boxes and spinning a narrative that somehow ends with us having to be leaders in fixing a problem. And that's exactly what Kagan wants to do. He wants to say, see, this is why we must have bold American leadership, because without it, the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket.
Well, that raises a number of issues. How should the United States promote democracy across the world? Should the United States be doing that anymore? It seems Kagan views international relations as inherently antagonistic, liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Now, maybe he's right. And he might say, you'd be naive to think China or Russia has benign intentions, and maybe even foolish for the United States to just sit back and not do something about it.
Right. But I also think that we tend to believe, or at least people like Robert Kagan tend to believe, or want us to believe, the presence of a strongman in Hungary, Poland, particularly Russia and China, means that they are a threat to everybody else. And that's a dividing line there, because he's suggesting that if we don't get involved and we don't show leadership, that somehow their authoritarianism is expansionist, and that it will pour over borders and become threats to their neighbors. So we see that particularly with Russia today, that if we don't get involved, or we don't bring, say, Ukraine into the bosom of NATO, it never takes into account that there are national dynamics, there are national trends and politics that are negative in nature, that we would not want to have here, but it's none of our business. And I feel like the Kagans of the world don't get that. They don't want to get that, because that means that somehow that American leadership is unnecessary in the world. And like I said, they want to believe that if we're not leading the world, somehow things will go quite awry. And so it doesn't fit the narrative to just let it be and let Russians be Russians and let them take care of their own problems.
Something they may be overlooking is just how weak Russia actually is. I don't see Russia as necessarily a strong country. Economically, it has problems, and it bit off more than it could chew in Ukraine. I mean, that war is blown back on Russia to negative effect.
Right. And then one of the things that the Kagans of the world need to do is to engage in an inflation, whether it be threat inflation, whether it's the inflation of another country's power and strength. And Russia is a perfect example, just like you touched upon. Economically, they are weak right now. They're a fraction of our economy. But if we rely on reality like that, then it's hard to convince people in the American audience that they need to be concerned, that they need to support a bigger NATO, an expanded NATO, that they need to support more money for their defense budget, for new weapons, and to deploy missile defense systems in other countries, or put more troops in Poland and keep troops in Germany that Trump wanted to get out. So it's all an exercise of convincing the American taxpayer that they have to keep investing in sort of this American primacy overseas. So if Americans were clued in to the fact that maybe Russia isn't as big as a bugaboo as we're saying, they might be a little more circumspect about where all these resources were going, especially at a time when we could be using, the resources back home.
Yes. China is an interesting case, and I don't pretend to know everything about it. I've had China experts on the podcast to help explain things, but China continues to pull its population out of extreme poverty. It continues to expand its influence without using its military with the Belt and Road Initiative in Eurasia. And I think some Western observers are concerned because China has been able to liberalize its economy without liberalizing its politics. It is still a one-party authoritarian state.
I think what I've found to be particularly hard to wrap my arms around here is that there are two channels of thought. You have very smart people who say the Belt and Road Initiative, the authoritarian policies, maritime security issues in the South China Sea, the military buildup, that is, in fact, a possible threat to the United States and its allies. First, its allies. Second, expansionism could affect our sphere of influence in the region and maybe and beyond, as you see China making new trade deals and cementing alliances in places as far-flung as the Middle East, in which we have obviously ties to relationships with militarily, trade, and otherwise. And so there is a school of thought that, yes, as two major powers fighting for influence, we have to keep vigilant, we have to keep involved, we have to show strength. But then you have the other track, which is saying that China has not shown these expansionist impulses that the other side says. That yes, they have been a bully in the South China Sea to their allies, but they do not mean to go beyond that. And what is it, our business anyway? Is that a direct threat to national security? Can we not make sure that our allies, whether it be Japan or the Philippines, be able to defend themselves? Can we not act diplomatically and open up channels of diplomacy rather than military primacy? Wouldn't that be the healthier, more productive way of going? So I feel that we're at a crossroads here where we could easily slip into perhaps a Cold War situation if we continue down the military approach. Or we could just say, listen, this is a multipolar world. So all of this is competing right now.
We should talk about Taiwan here because whatever the formal or official arrangement, Taiwan is basically an independent democratic country. However, Taiwan and the United States are not formal allies. And there is the question, what happens if China or when China tries to reabsorb Taiwan into the mainland? What would the United States do?
Right. And there are plenty of people who are saying that, and they're predicting that it might even happen soon. But is it going to happen sooner because we keep pushing it? We keep pushing for this strategic clarity in which we pronounce our defense of Taiwan. Does that mean if China does keep pushing with incursions, with planes, with ships into the Taiwan independence zone, does that mean that we are going to respond militarily? Are we ready to respond militarily? Are we willing to go to war with China over Taiwan? And I don't think that that's a debate that's effectively played out. I think it's great for talking points to say that we're on the side of democracy and that we support Taiwan and their earnest bid to be independent from China. We have been in a situation where we've had this ambiguity for 40 something years now. And changing that up now might be putting some things into play that we're not willing to see all the way through.
We've been talking about democracy in political terms, whether there are elections, political pluralism, the rise of authoritarianism. But there was a recent poll by the Alliance for Democracy's Foundation. It found that people across the globe believe income inequality is a threat to democracy, and that the unchecked power of social media platforms and big tech companies is also eroding democracy. That's something that we often overlook when we talk about politics.
Right. And as you remember, this country endured some major protests in the Occupy Wall Street movement. I mean, I mentioned, earlier our loss in faith in the institutions. That was a perfect example of a real backlash against the power of Wall Street, the swampiness of Wall Street and its cozy relationships to government and crafting regulations to serve it and not the people, and also against globalization. People sense that corporations here had more fealty to the supranational organizations overseas. So we saw a backlash to that. And I think you can enjoin big tech and Silicon Valley in that. I think people are looking at a loss of control when it comes to their personal information. They feel shut out on major media platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, which have become, heavily politicized. That has a real eroding effect on how people view their rights and their role in democracy.
So we'll wrap it up by coming back to the beginning of the conversation about whether democracy is in trouble. I think when we look at Europe now, where there were some fears that the Europe of the 21st century was going to start looking like the Europe of the 1920s and the 1930s, well, democracy is held, maybe not so much in Hungary, and there have been some right-wing movements that have achieved electoral success in places like Italy and Poland, but maybe some of those concerns were overwrought.
I think you said it right there, electoral success. The fact that there have been elections, the fact that some of these actors like Viktor Orban and others and Duda in Poland have been elected, democratically elected by the people there, says a lot. It basically says it's not an autocracy yet. I know that there has been warnings over the last several years about Poland slipping into autocracy, Hungary slipping into autocracy. There was much to do about the five-star movement and the right-wing counterpart in Italy for a while there. But the fact is, there are still elections. I'm not saying that there aren't worrisome trends in some of these countries. Now, Viktor Orban is not somebody that I am going to defend. He is particularly power hungry. And some of the things that he's done with the judiciary and with the media, and now it turns out that he's put a bunch of all of the universities under a foundational system so that even if he doesn't win in the next election, he can get all his cronies, in charge of all the university systems. It's worrisome in that regard. But do I think that it's part of a larger trend of authoritarianism in Europe? No, because when this story first kind of broke, it was during a crisis, a migration crisis. And a lot of these countries were reacting to increased flows of migrants into their countries. And some of them didn't like it, like Hungary, and they literally put a stop to it. Hungary is a nationalistic country. They wanted to keep their borders closed. They don't want to pay fealty to Brussels and the EU. They mistrust the EU. They want to do things their own way. As far as I'm concerned, that's their business. And I know there are a lot of people in Hungary that have been protesting, and that's their business too. And I feel like the same with Poland. As much as they fought communism, they're still a conservative Catholic country. But as long as there are elections, I feel like it's overwrought to see like the next Hitler rising. Same with Brexit. So much was said about Brexit. Much of that was a response to the overburdening of the EU. a lot of these countries don't want to be part of a multinational system in which Germany seems to get all the financial benefits. And these countries are being told what to do, how to spend their money, and how to live their lives. And a lot of it is liberal imposition of liberal values and standards and mores on countries that are more conservative, and they don't want to hear of it. So I think we should stop putting an American lens on everything.
Kelly Vlahos of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. If the immediate aftermath of the Cold War led us to be overly optimistic about democracy's march, maybe today we're too pessimistic about its demise. Whatever your view, it is worth thinking and talking about. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
There are a lot of exotic notions about what are the most important points in American history. I simply disagree with the notion that the New York Times laid out there that the year 1619 was one of those years.
Should the 1619 Project be taught in schools? The Pulitzer Prize-winning project by the New York Times has been attacked by conservatives and some of the most prominent historians in the country. What the 1619 Project gets right and wrong about our past. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.